the great tapestry of England's medieval history, there are threads so faint, so nearly lost to the centuries, that only with careful attention can they be seen again. They belong to figures who once shaped the fate of kingdoms, and yet, in time, were almost erased. One such thread is that of Thomas of Woodstock, a prince by birth, a soldier by duty, an enemy to kings, and perhaps the victim of one. He was the youngest son of King Edward III, brother to the famed Black Prince, uncle to King Richard II, and a man whose life began in the golden glow of Plantagenet glory, only to end in the shadows of suspicion, conspiracy, and death. Tonight, we travel back to the 14th century, an age of chivalry and war, of plague and rebellion, to uncover the story of the forgotten prince. It was the 7th of January, 1355, when Thomas of Woodstock entered the world. He was born into the royal house of Plantagenet, the 10th and youngest child of King Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainaut. By the time Thomas first drew breath, England stood as one of the great powers of Christendom, its armies victorious on the fields of Crécy and Poitiers, its monarch hailed as a warrior king of unmatched renown. But Thomas's birth came in a moment when the bright summer of Edward III's reign was already shading toward autumn. The Black Death had swept through England just a few years before, leaving entire villages empty, the fields untended, and the kingdom forever changed. The great victories in France were beginning to slow, the war dragging into an uneasy stalemate, and at court, the king's once youthful vigor was giving way to age, and with it, to factional rivalries among his ambitious sons and their allies. Thomas was the youngest of a sprawling royal brood, brothers who towered over him in age, reputation, and political power. Edward, the Black Prince, was a legend in the making, already a hero of battle by the time Thomas was learning to walk. Lionel of Antwerp, tall and proud, commanded lands in Ireland and influence at court. John of Gaunt, shrewd and calculating, was fast becoming the power behind the throne. And Edmund of Langley, the solid and dependable soldier, was already earning his place as a trusted captain in the king's wars. In such a family, a youngest son had few easy paths to glory. He would have to fight for it. Thomas's earliest years were marked by the constant backdrop of conflict. England was deep into the 100 Years' War, a long and grinding struggle with France that had already stretched across 2 decades. The boy grew up surrounded by tales of knightly valor and courtly honor. He would have seen the banners of returning captains paraded through the streets, heard the chants of the people cheering their heroes. The air in Windsor, where the royal children often stayed, was thick with the sound of armor being mended, the neighing of war horses, and the sharp ring of the blacksmith's hammer. From his earliest days, Thomas was trained in the arts expected of a prince: riding, swordplay, archery, and the codes of chivalry. He learned Latin and French, the languages of diplomacy and war, and would have been taught the intricate dance of politics at the side of his mother, Queen Philippa, a woman known for her wisdom, grace, and firm sense of justice. Yet Thomas was not just a child of privilege. He was also a child of change. He lived in a realm where the feudal order was being shaken by the plague's devastation, where peasants began to demand wages and freedoms once unthinkable, and where even a king's authority could be challenged by Parliament. In 1369, when Thomas was just 14, his mother Philippa died. Her passing was a blow not only to the royal family, but to the entire kingdom, for she had been a stabilizing force in Edward III's court. Without her presence, the rivalries between the king's sons began to deepen. For Thomas, the loss was personal and political. His mother had been his shield, protecting him perhaps from being overshadowed entirely by his elder brothers. With her gone, he would have to rely more on his own wits and ambition. In the years that followed, Thomas watched his father's final military ventures unfold. Though still a boy, he accompanied the court on progresses, learning the business of rulership firsthand. He would have seen his father's frustration as fortunes in France began to turn. By the early 1370s, Edward III was no longer the unstoppable warrior of Calais. The Black Prince, crippled by illness, had returned from the war in poor health. John of Gaunt's costly campaigns in France were failing to secure lasting gains. England was facing a new reality. The war that had once brought glory now threatened to bleed the realm dry. In 1377, Edward III died. The crown passed not to one of his seasoned sons, but to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, son of the late Black Prince. Thomas of Woodstock was now an uncle to the king. At 22, he was a knight of royal blood, with the wealth and lands appropriate to his station, but still without a clear sphere of command. That soon changed. In 1377, Thomas was made Earl of Buckingham, a title that gave him stature, but also responsibility. It was a recognition of his place in the royal family, and a sign that, despite being the youngest son, he was expected to play a role in the governance of the realm. The accession of young Richard II was a delicate moment. England's enemies sensed weakness. The French renewed their attacks along the coasts, and piracy in the Channel became a serious threat. Thomas, eager to prove himself, took on the challenge of leading military expeditions. His early campaigns were not always glorious. Some were marred by lack of resources or political hesitation, but they established him as a capable commander. He served in Brittany and in the defense of English territories in France, often working alongside his brother Edmund of Langley. Over the next decade, Thomas's influence grew. His combination of royal blood, military experience, and political ambition made him a natural leader among the king's uncles. He became one of Richard II's chief advisors, though the relationship between uncle and nephew was never entirely warm. Thomas was known for his stern manner, his conservative politics, and his mistrust of Richard's youthful favorites. He saw himself as a guardian of the realm, perhaps even of the king himself, though others saw him as overbearing, even dangerous. In 1385, Thomas was elevated to the title of Duke of Gloucester, one of the highest honors in the realm. The boy born in the fading days of Edward III's glory was now among the most powerful men in England. And with that power came enemies, and a path that would, in time, lead him toward the shadowed mystery of his death. The year was 1377. England was in mourning. King Edward III, the once great warrior, victor of Crecy, conqueror of Poitiers, was dead. His reign, which had begun in a blaze of youthful triumph, ended in shadows of decline, corruption, and grief. The throne did not pass to one of his surviving sons, those seasoned princes who had fought in his wars. Instead, it passed to a boy of only 10 years old. Richard of Bordeaux, the son of Edward's eldest heir, the Black Prince, who had died before his father. And so England's destiny fell into the hands of a child. But a child cannot rule alone, and in this vacuum, the king's uncles stepped forward, men of power, of ambition, and of sharply divided loyalties. Among them was Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest of Edward's sons, the Shadow Prince, the ambitious uncle. Richard II's accession marked a dangerous turning point. At just 10 years old, he was too young to steer the turbulent politics of his kingdom. England was beset on all sides. The 100 Years' War dragged on, the treasury strained, the seas threatened by French raids and piracy. At home, the scars of plague still lingered, labor unrest simmered, and Parliament grew ever more assertive. The boy king sat on the throne, but it was his uncles and their allies who guided the helm of the ship of state. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the eldest surviving son of Edward III, was the most powerful of the uncles. He had vast lands, a royal demeanor, and a taste for continental ambition. Yet his popularity among the English people was poisoned by suspicion. Many whispered that Gaunt sought the crown for himself. Edmund of Langley, steady, dependable, but politically unremarkable, remained loyal to his elder brother Gaunt, rarely pushing himself into conflict. And then there was Thomas of Woodstock. At 22 years old, Thomas had inherited neither the renown of the Black Prince, nor the wealth of Lancaster, nor the reliability of Langley. But what he had was determination, energy, and a burning ambition not to be left behind. For Thomas knew this was his moment. With a boy on the throne and rivalries at court dividing his brothers, he could step out of the long shadows of his youth. In the first months of Richard's reign, Thomas was granted a new title, Earl of Buckingham. It was more than ceremony, it was an opportunity. The earldom gave him lands, income, and a place among the high peers of England. It was recognition of his station as the king's uncle, but also a reminder that he was still junior to his elder brothers in influence. And Thomas would not be satisfied with mere recognition. The kingdom he entered into as a statesman was unstable. The French, emboldened by England's uncertainty, struck at the coastlines. In the south, towns like Rye, Hastings, and Winchelsea were raided and burned. Villagers fled inland in terror as smoke rose on the horizon. The Channel was no longer safe. Pirates and enemy fleets prowled the waters, seizing merchant ships and choking England's trade. And across the sea in France, the long war that Edward III had once prosecuted with such fury now dragged on in bitterness and stalemate. To a young noble like Thomas, this chaos was not only a threat, it was an opportunity. Here was a chance to prove himself, to gain honor, to carve a reputation in steel and blood. In 1377, Thomas took command in naval defenses, and by 1378, he was engaged in campaigns on the continent. He joined his brother Edmund of Langley in an expedition to Brittany, an area long contested in the war with France. The campaign was harsh. Supplies ran thin. Morale was strained. The English found themselves bogged down, harassed by French forces, and struggling to achieve decisive victories. And yet, Thomas proved himself. Though the campaign did not bring glory, it established him as a commander willing to share the hardships of his men. Chroniclers note his stern discipline, his insistence on order, and his refusal to indulge in the idle comforts of nobility while his soldiers suffered. It was during these years that Thomas earned a reputation as a strict, almost severe figure, respected, if not loved. But if the battlefields gave Thomas a chance to show his worth, the court was another matter entirely. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, cast a long shadow over the realm. He was the richest man in England, a man who styled himself a king in all but name, and who even harbored claims to the throne of Castile through his marriage. Thomas resented him. He saw in Gaunt a rival whose ambitions could endanger the stability of the young king's reign. Where Gaunt sought to dominate Richard's minority, Thomas positioned himself as a defender of the boy's interests. Though whether this was out of loyalty or out of ambition is harder to say. The two brothers clashed repeatedly in council. Gaunt's expansive vision and desire for continental prestige collided with Thomas's more rigid, inward-looking conservatism. The court grew divided, and Richard's council chambers echoed with sharp words and veiled threats. The greatest test of Richard's minority came in 1381, when the simmering anger of the common people erupted in one of the most dramatic uprisings in English history, the Peasants' Revolt. The causes were many. Decades of plague had upset the old feudal order. Laborers demanded higher wages and heavy taxation, particularly the hated poll tax, pushed the poor to breaking point. In June of 1381, thousands of rebels rose in Kent and Essex. They marched on London under leaders like Wat Tyler and John Ball, their slogans ringing through the countryside. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? They stormed the city, burned the houses of officials, and even executed the Archbishop of Canterbury. For a moment, the kingdom trembled. Richard II, though only 14, confronted the rebels personally at Mile End and later at Smithfield. His courage in those moments would echo throughout his reign. But the suppression of the revolt was not only his doing, it was also the work of his uncles and advisors, who ensured the army and nobility rallied to the crown. Thomas of Woodstock, as a leading royal uncle, played a critical role in restoring order. He pushed for harsh reprisals, insisting that the rebellion could not be tolerated. Villages that had risen were punished, rebels hunted down, executions carried out. The revolt left scars. It deepened the mistrust between rulers and ruled, and it hardened Thomas's view of governance. To him, mercy was weakness, and discipline was the only safeguard of royal authority. By the early 1380s, Thomas of Woodstock had become more than just another royal uncle. He was emerging as a central figure in the governance of England. He had land, wealth, and the ear of Parliament. He had a reputation for stern justice, for martial skill, and for being unafraid to confront even his own brothers when he believed the crown's interests were at stake. And he had ambition. Not the reckless, flamboyant ambition of a usurper, but the cold, calculated ambition of a man who believed he knew better than others how England should be ruled. To some, he was a protector of the young king. To others, he was already laying the foundations of tyranny. The years of Richard's minority forged Thomas of Woodstock into a political force. He was no longer the forgotten youngest son of Edward III. He was now a peer of the realm, a commander of armies, a counselor to kings. But in every council chamber, in every battlefield tent, in every whispered conversation in the corridors of Westminster, there lingered a question. Was Thomas of Woodstock serving the king, or was he serving himself? The answer would soon become clear, for in the years ahead, the young Richard would come of age. And when he sought to assert his independence, he would find his greatest rival not in France, nor in Parliament, nor even in the people, but in his own uncle. The ambitious Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester to be, would become both the king's most powerful ally and his most dangerous enemy. The child king was growing into his crown. The ambitious uncle was sharpening his claws, and England was sliding toward a collision that would shake the very foundations of its monarchy. This was only the beginning. The late 1380s were a turning point in England's political life. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, uncle to King Richard II, and one of the most powerful men in the realm, stood at the height of his influence. He was feared by courtiers, respected by the commons, and resented by the crown. But power carries shadows, and for Thomas, those shadows were lengthening. The boy king whom Thomas had once guided, the fragile Richard II, was now a man in his early 20s, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of his uncles. Resentment, mistrust, and the simmering desire for revenge filled the young king's heart. For years, Thomas had acted not only as a guardian, but as a warden of the crown, seizing control of Parliament, leading the Lords Appellant against the king's favorites, and dictating England's politics by sheer force of will. To many, Gloucester was not simply the king's uncle, but the king in all but name. And yet, such dominance could never last. Richard II was not like his grandfather Edward III, the warrior king who had filled England's chronicles with glory. Nor was he like his father, the Black Prince, the chivalric hero whose legend still haunted every battlefield. Richard was different. He loved pageantry, splendor, ceremony. He believed in kingship as a divine institution, elevated above the squabbling of nobles. He sought peace abroad and dignity at home. But Thomas of Woodstock stood for a harder, older vision of power. War in France, austerity in government, and the primacy of the nobility over royal whim. Their clash was inevitable. As Richard sought to surround himself with loyal allies, men like Robert de Vere, Michael de la Pole, and a circle of ambitious courtiers, Thomas saw only corruption. He viewed these men as parasites, draining England's coffers and bending the young king's ear against the good of the realm. By 1387, Gloucester's suspicions hardened into rebellion. He and other powerful nobles, the Lords Appellant, marched against the king's favorites, defeating them at Radcot Bridge. The following year, the infamous Merciless Parliament of 1388 destroyed Richard's circle. De Vere fled into exile. De la Pole was stripped of titles. Many others were executed. It was Thomas of Woodstock who drove this purge, his voice demanding blood, his will unyielding. Richard II never forgot, and he never forgave. The 1390s brought a shift. The young king grew into manhood, gathering strength, wealth, and loyal supporters. While Thomas retreated into his estates at Plantagenet Castle, Richard began to plot. Outwardly, reconciliation was spoken of. The king appeared to tolerate his uncle's presence at court. But behind closed doors, whispers carried across Westminster. Richard would have his vengeance. By 1397, the stage was set. Richard had secured his power base. He brought back old allies, tightened his circle, and most crucially, created a climate of fear. He had learned patience, and he was ready to strike. Thomas of Woodstock, who had once been master of the realm, now found himself isolated. Where once Parliament bent to his will, now it bowed to the king. Where once his brothers of the royal house stood united, now they scattered or shrank from confrontation. Richard's revenge would not be swift and public like Thomas's had been. No, his vengeance would be quiet, calculated, and devastating. It began in the summer of 1397. In the heart of Essex, at his beloved fortress of Plantagenet, Thomas of Woodstock lived with a semblance of peace. The castle, with its high walls and moat, symbolized his strength, his independence, and his pride. But even stone cannot keep out betrayal. On the king's orders, a trusted captain, the Duke of Norfolk, rode to Plantagenet with a band of armed men. Their mission, to seize the Duke of Gloucester. The night was heavy, the air thick with tension. Thomas, taken by surprise, could scarcely believe the treachery, The king, his nephew, had sent soldiers not in parley, but in secrecy. He was betrayed in his own home. Accounts tell us Thomas resisted, demanding to see a warrant, demanding to face his accusers openly. But there would be no trial, no justice. He was arrested under the cloak of night, dragged from his halls, and carried away into darkness, his destination, Calais, the English stronghold across the Channel. Far from his allies, far from his family, far from the power he had once commanded. There, in the cold stone walls of Calais Castle, Thomas of Woodstock would meet his end. Officially, Thomas of Woodstock never stood trial. His name would later be condemned by Parliament, his estate seized, his legacy blackened. But the manner of his death remains shrouded in mystery. Some chronicles claim he was suffocated quietly, smothered with a feather bed, to leave no mark upon his body. Others whisper he was strangled with a garrote in the dungeons of Calais. Still others suggest poison, a slow and agonizing silencing of the king's uncle. What is certain is this: Thomas of Woodstock never returned from Calais alive. By September of 1397, he was dead. The official explanation was vague, a veil of silence draped across the act. But the truth was plain to all who watched. Richard II had struck at last, avenging the humiliations of his youth. The ambitious uncle, once the power behind the throne, had fallen. Not on the battlefield, not in the courts of Parliament, but in the secret darkness of his prison, where whispers replaced judgment and murder replaced justice. The death of Thomas of Woodstock sent shockwaves across England. His allies, terrified, crumbled before the king's wrath. Richard II stood triumphant, no longer the fragile boy mocked and constrained, but a monarch who had struck down his own blood to secure his authority. Yet in destroying his uncle, Richard also sowed the seeds of his downfall, for the nobles of England now knew their king was dangerous, vindictive, and unbound by mercy. Fear replaced trust, and suspicion replaced loyalty. In 1399, only 2 years later, Richard himself would be deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, the son of another of Thomas's brothers. The crown that Thomas of Woodstock had once sought to protect, and perhaps even to control, now fell into the hands of a new dynasty, the Lancastrians. Thomas of Woodstock, the forgotten prince, was remembered not for triumph but for tragedy. His death, mysterious, brutal, and unjust, became a symbol of Richard II's tyranny, a warning written in blood upon the pages of England's history. Thomas of Woodstock's story is the story of ambition colliding with kingship. He rose as protector, as guardian, as wielder of power. But in the end, he fell not in open defiance, but in the shadows, undone by the very crown he had once sought to command. His fate was silence, his memory obscured, his body left behind in a foreign fortress, and yet, his ghost lingers in England's chronicles, a shadow prince who reminds us that in the game of power, no man, not even a king's uncle, is ever safe. England, in the late 1380s, a kingdom scarred by decades of war against France, a kingdom drained by plague, famine, and taxation, and a kingdom whose monarch, Richard II, was no longer a boy, but not yet the ruler his realm demanded. By 1386, the young king was 20, old enough to wear the crown in truth, old enough to demand obedience, but his vision of kingship clashed violently with the traditions of his realm and with the ambitions of those who stood closest to him. And among these rivals, none was more dangerous, more relentless, than his own uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. Richard II was unlike the kings who had come before him. Where his grandfather Edward III had been a warrior, Richard sought splendor and ceremony. Where Edward had been pragmatic, Richard leaned toward art, philosophy, and the grandeur of monarchy itself. Around him clustered a circle of companions, young, polished, and ambitious. Robert de Vere, Duke of Ireland, Richard's dearest friend, and perhaps his closest confidant. Michael de la Pole, son of a merchant, risen to the lofty station of chancellor, a man who owed everything to the king's favor. And others, men despised by the entrenched nobility, who saw in them not loyalty, but corruption and greed. To Richard, these men were allies. To the older nobility, they were parasites feeding upon the crown, and none despised them more than Thomas of Woodstock, the uncle who believed himself the true guardian of England, and who would not stand idly by as the crown, in his eyes, fell into ruin. Thomas of Woodstock had always been ambitious. As the youngest son of Edward III, he inherited his father's fierce pride, but not the throne. He had fought in France, commanded armies, and believed himself the last true protector of the old Plantagenet strength. But beneath this facade of loyalty lay ambition. Thomas believed that Richard was weak, unfit to rule without firm guidance, and if Richard would not accept such guidance, Thomas was prepared to force it upon him. And so, he began to rally allies, the Earl of Arundel, the Earl of Warwick, two powerful magnates, suspicious of Richard's court and hungry to assert their own influence. And soon more would join them. Henry Bolingbroke, the king's cousin and son of John of Gaunt, and Thomas Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham. Together, they formed a brotherhood of opposition. Together, they became the Lords Appellant. The name they chose was deliberate. They were not rebels. They did not seek to overthrow the king himself. Instead, they claimed to appeal against the king's favorites, to place them on trial for treason, for corruption, for leading England astray. But make no mistake, their true target was Richard himself, the young monarch who had surrounded himself with men they hated, the king who dared to dream of ruling without their consent. In the winter of 1387, their challenge turned from words into war. Richard's dearest companion, Robert de Vere, gathered an army loyal to the crown. He marched to meet the Lords Appellant at Radcot Bridge, a vital crossing in Oxfordshire. What followed was less a battle than a collapse. De Vere's army was plagued by defections. Men who had sworn loyalty to the king deserted him in the night. When the Appellants advanced, de Vere's forces scattered. The Duke himself fled, galloping desperately across the frozen fields, abandoning the cause of his king. The humiliation was total. Richard's authority shattered, his court broken, and his favorites now at the mercy of his enemies. Parliament was summoned in February of 1388. But this was no ordinary session. It would be remembered forever as the Merciless Parliament. Before the assembled peers, the king's closest companions were brought forth: Michael de la Pole, Robert Tresilian, Chief Justice of England, Nicholas Brembre, former Mayor of London, all accused of treason, all condemned. The sentences were brutal. Tresilian hanged, Brembre beheaded, others exiled, their lands stripped, their honors erased. Only Robert de Vere escaped with his life, fleeing abroad to Flanders, where he would die years later, a broken man, far from the king who had loved him. For Richard, it was a personal catastrophe. He had been forced to watch as his friends were destroyed, and though the Lords Appellant spared him, leaving the crown upon his head, they had reduced the monarchy itself to submission. To be spared may sound merciful, but to Richard it was the cruelest punishment of all. He remained king, yet powerless. He wore the crown, yet it was tarnished. He sat upon the throne, but the lords ruled in his stead. The merciless Parliament had broken him publicly, stripped him of dignity, and made plain to all that a monarch of England could be defied, humiliated, and caged. This scar would never heal. Richard II would remember, and Richard II would wait. The triumph of the Lords Appellant seemed complete. They had removed the king's counselors. They had bent the crown to their will, but in their triumph lay the seeds of their downfall, for they had humiliated not merely Richard's household, but Richard himself. And kings do not forget. Kings do not forgive. Richard II, though young, though beaten, though disgraced, would rise again. And when he did, the very men who had humbled him would pay the price. The Lords Appellant believed they had saved England. They believed they had restored honor to the crown and justice to the realm. But history remembers them differently. For their victory, their parliament, their unrelenting cruelty would drive Richard to become something far darker than they had feared. The boy king had been humbled, but the man who emerged from that humiliation would not be merciful. This was the age of the Lords Appellant. This was the Parliament without mercy, and it was only the beginning of Richard II's descent into vengeance. England, the year is 1397. The scars of the merciless Parliament still fester, etched into the very foundations of Richard II's reign. Once a boy king cowed into submission by his uncles and the Lords Appellant, Richard is no longer a child. He has grown into a man, proud, ambitious, and unyielding, but beneath the gilded crown lies a wound that never healed. Humiliation, betrayal, and the shadow of his stolen authority burn deep within him. Richard has not forgotten. Richard has not forgiven. And now, after nearly a decade of quiet patience, the king strikes back. The storm of vengeance that will engulf Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, begins to take shape, cloaked in shadows, whispered in corridors, and sharpened behind locked doors. Once dismissed as weak, indecisive, and vain, Richard emerges in the late 1390s with a new face. Regal, commanding, and frighteningly resolute. He dresses in silks and gold-threaded robes, no longer as a foppish youth, but as a monarch who embodies divine majesty. But Richard's transformation is not just one of appearance. His vision of kingship has hardened. He believes utterly in his sacred right to rule without constraint. Parliament, noble councils, and the meddling hands of uncles are to him nothing but obstacles. He surrounds himself with loyal courtiers, men like Robert de Vere, Michael de la Pole, and others who suffered in the days of the Appellants. They whisper to him of vengeance. They remind him of every insult, every humiliation, every drop of blood spilled in the name of justice. Richard listens, and he waits. By 1397, Richard's patience has worn thin. His enemies, those who once chained his throne with the language of reform, are complacent. They believe the king too cowed to act. But Richard is a serpent in the grass. He moves silently, slowly, weaving his web of revenge. He calls Parliament to meet, but not the Parliament of consensus. Instead, it will be a Parliament of retribution. One by one, he tests the loyalties of the lords. He isolates the strongest voices. He whispers promises to some, threats to others. The court becomes a theater of masks, each man playing a role, uncertain who has the king's ear. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, remains Richard's greatest shadow. Ambitious, arrogant, and proud, Gloucester had once stood as the king's jailer, his tormentor, his self-declared protector. Richard has never forgotten Gloucester's hand in the Merciless Parliament, the hand that toppled his friends and bound his crown in shame. Now Gloucester stands in Parliament, greying and still unbowed, believing himself untouchable. But Richard has made his choice. Gloucester will fall. Richard begins to weave. Secret councils gather in the dead of night. Cloaked messengers slip through the torchlit halls of Westminster. Quiet meetings are held with men of action, the Earl of Nottingham, the Duke of Norfolk, and those willing to spill blood for royal favor. Accusations of treason are sharpened like blades. Gloucester's name is whispered in the same breath as conspiracy, rebellion, and betrayal. Old wounds are reopened, and Richard paints his uncle not as a guardian of the crown, but as a danger to the throne itself. It is a masterstroke of political theater. The king, once humiliated, now seizes the narrative. Gloucester, the supposed protector, is recast as the betrayer. And in the shadows, the people begin to murmur. Has the Duke of Gloucester gone too far? By late summer 1397, Gloucester's fate is sealed. Richard, cloaked in his newfound authority, strikes. Gloucester is arrested under royal command, seized by men loyal to the king, and carried away from London. No trial, no open council. Instead, the Duke is swept into silence, transported to Calais, an English stronghold across the Channel. There, behind fortress walls, Gloucester disappears into the shadows. His voice is silenced, his fate uncertain. For Richard, it is not enough to arrest him. Gloucester's very existence is a threat, a reminder of a time when the king was humiliated before his people. And so, in the silence of Calais, Gloucester's story begins to end. England watches in silence. The arrest of a royal duke, the king's own uncle, shocks the realm. Some whisper in taverns that Gloucester was plotting treason. Others murmur that Richard's vengeance has finally begun. The lords appellant who once ruled over the king now tremble, for they know, if Gloucester can fall, none of them are safe. Richard has cast the die. His revenge is set in motion. The question that now lingers over England is this: how far will the king go to erase his humiliation? The answer lies not in Parliament, nor in the courts. It lies in shadows, betrayal, and death. The Shadow Prince, Thomas of Woodstock, is now a prisoner of his nephew, and the king is only just beginning. In the fading twilight of September 1397, the stillness around Pleshy Castle was broken by the sound of armored hooves upon the road. Within the thick stone walls, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, sat unaware that this evening would mark the end of his freedom, and perhaps the end of his life. He was a prince of the royal blood, uncle to King Richard II, son of Edward III, and once one of the most powerful men in England. Yet now his enemies had woven a net around him, and it was tightening. At Richard's command, the royal captain Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, rode with a company of men-at-arms. Their orders were sealed and secret. To the unsuspecting villagers who saw them pass, they were but the king's messengers. To Gloucester, they would be the heralds of betrayal. As the company approached the gates of Plantagenet, the air grew tense. The castle guards hesitated, recognizing Norfolk, a nobleman of the king's confidence. But behind courtesy lay menace. Norfolk carried not a message, but a warrant of arrest. Inside, Gloucester dined with his household, perhaps comforted by the routines of family and loyalty. His laughter, if there was laughter, soon faded when Norfolk entered the hall, helm tucked beneath his arm, eyes hard with purpose. The charge was given. Gloucester was accused of treason. Imagine the silence that must have filled that chamber, the disbelief of retainers, the shock of Gloucester himself. He, who had once stood in judgment over others during the Merciless Parliament, now faced the sharp edge of royal retribution. Without the chance to resist, Gloucester was taken into custody. His arms were seized, his household dismissed, his power extinguished in a single moment. The guards led him from the safety of his walls into the gathering night. The gates of Plantagenet closed behind him, not in protection, but in finality. The arrest was not merely an act of justice, it was a warning. The king had struck against his uncle, the most dangerous of the Lord's Appellant. And with that strike, Richard II declared to all of England that he was no longer the young king who could be bent by nobles. He was master, and none would defy him without consequence. As Gloucester was escorted away under heavy guard, the villagers of Plantagenet whispered. The Shadow Prince, once a thorn in the king's side, was now bound in chains. None could know if they would ever see him return. From Plantagenet, Gloucester's captors led him toward London. The journey was long and somber, marked by the ever-present clink of iron and the slow trudge of horses. The Duke's mind must have swirled with questions. Would he face trial before Parliament? Would he, like others before him, be imprisoned in the Tower and later pardoned? Or did Richard intend something far darker? The roads of England were not empty. Merchants, peasants, and friars passed, some pausing to glance at the column of armed men and their noble prisoner. They saw a hooded figure riding under guard, a man once second only to the king himself. Rumors spread like wildfire. Gloucester had been taken. The king was moving against his uncle. In London, news arrived before Gloucester himself. Whispers spread through Westminster, among merchants along the Thames, and in the taverns where men dared to mutter the name of the fallen duke. Many wondered, if Gloucester could fall, who would be safe? But Gloucester would not remain long in London. Richard II, wary of the city's mood and fearing that his uncle's presence might stir rebellion, devised another plan. The Duke would not face judgment in Westminster, nor in the Tower, where the eyes of the people might weigh upon his fate. Instead, he would be removed from sight, beyond the reach of sudden rescue. His destination: Calais, England's stronghold on the continent. The decision was cunning. Calais was far from prying eyes, under firm royal control, and easily guarded by loyal captains. There, across the narrow sea, Gloucester could be dealt with quietly, away from the noise of London and the gossip of the commons. So it was that Gloucester, stripped of dignity, was ferried across the Thames, past the looming shadow of the Tower of London, a reminder of what might have been his prison, but not his final cell. He was placed aboard a royal ship, bound for Calais. The sea voyage was grim. The winds whipped against the sails, and the spray of salt water stung the faces of guards and prisoner alike. Gloucester, once accustomed to leading armies across these same waters in campaigns against France, now crossed them as a captive, shackled to the will of his nephew. He may have remembered the glories of Crécy and Poitiers, the victories of his father Edward III, the splendor of England's triumphs in France. But those memories, proud as they were, must have burned bitterly now. For he, a son of that noble line, was being carried not to battle, but to silence. At night, the ship creaked and groaned as waves crashed against its hull. The guards kept close watch, for though Gloucester was captive, he remained dangerous in name and presence. Yet he made no escape attempt, for there was none to make. His fate was bound to the king's will, and the sea itself closed around him like a prison. When the vessel reached the white cliffs of Calais, the journey ended. But for Gloucester, it was only the beginning of his darkest chapter. He was delivered to the castle, a fortress of grey stone overlooking the harbour. Here, in chambers far from England, he would spend his final days. None knew what awaited him, but whispers of doom followed him like a shadow. For Richard II had made his choice. The Merciless Parliament had condemned men in blood a decade before. Now, in his own merciless reckoning, the king would answer his uncle's defiance with chains, with silence, and with death. The arrest of Thomas of Woodstock was not merely the downfall of a single man. It was the unraveling of a principle, the breaking of a fragile balance that had held crown and nobility together. With his seizure at Plantagenet and his removal to Calais, England crossed a threshold from which there was no return. This was not justice. It was vengeance, dressed in the cloak of necessity. Richard II had endured years of humiliation at the hands of the Lord's Appellant, his authority questioned, his crown nearly stripped from him. Now, with the tables turned, he reached not for reconciliation, but for retribution. And Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, the king's own uncle, once among the mightiest men in the realm, became the first and most tragic victim of this new chapter. The journey across the narrow sea was more than a passage from London to Calais. It was a descent into isolation, into betrayal, and into the waiting shadow of death. Each wave that crashed against the ship's hull was like a tolling bell, a reminder that Gloucester's world was narrowing to the cold stone walls of a fortress, where loyalty counted for nothing and the king's suspicion was law. Behind the looming walls of Calais, far from the watchful eyes of Parliament and the murmuring crowds of London, Thomas of Woodstock would disappear. No trial would be staged, no verdict read aloud to the realm, no appeal heard from the peers of England. His silence would serve Richard better than his words ever could. For in silence, there was no defense. In silence, there was no resistance. And so the Shadow Prince, the ambitious uncle who had once defied a king, the lord who had dared to claim justice against tyranny, was reduced to a prisoner, guarded not by laws, but by men who feared the royal will. Within those walls, in chambers dimly lit by flickering torches, the fate of Gloucester was sealed, though the manner of it remains cloaked in mystery. Was he strangled in the night? What poison slipped into his wine? Or did the mere weight of despair crush him before the deed was done? History does not speak with certainty. What is certain is this: his death echoed far beyond the stones of Calais. It cast a long shadow over Richard's reign, poisoning his rule with whispers of murder and betrayal. It emboldened his enemies and frightened his allies, for all now understood that no bond of blood, no oath of loyalty, no ancient privilege of noble birth could shield one from the king's wrath. The arrest of Thomas of Woodstock was not the end of a man's story alone. It was the prelude to greater storms, storms that would shake the very foundations of the English crown, for in taking his uncle, Richard struck not merely at a rival, but at the soul of his own kingship. And so the tale of Gloucester's fall does not end in Calais. It begins there, in the silence of a cell, in the shadows of betrayal, and in the memory of a kingdom that would never again look upon Richard II without seeing the ghost of the uncle he destroyed. Forever after, the chronicles would remember. Here, in the arrest and vanishing of Thomas of Woodstock, mercy gave way to vengeance. Here, the king revealed his truest self. And here, beneath the cold walls of Calais, the shadow of tyranny took form. The fortress of Calais stood like a stubborn sentinel upon the edge of the sea. Built of weather-worn stone, older than most living memory, it had endured wars, sieges, and endless winds that scoured its battlements with salt. By the year 1397, Calais was no longer merely a stronghold. It was a cage, and within its walls sat a man who had once commanded England itself. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, youngest son of Edward III, uncle to King Richard II, sat imprisoned not by foreign enemies, nor by rebels, but by his own kin. A prince of the blood, now reduced to a state of isolation so complete that the walls themselves seemed to press inward with silent malice. The air within Calais was heavy, damp with sea breath. The corridors echoed faintly with footsteps, muffled by tapestries and stone. Guards stationed at every passageway eyed the Duke not with sympathy, but with the distant loyalty of men sworn to the crown that had condemned him. They spoke little, but their silence carried weight enough. For Thomas knew, as did they, that he was not merely a prisoner. He was a marked man, awaiting a fate written in shadows. Each day bled into the next, with little distinction. A tray of food brought at dawn, another at dusk, bread stale at the edges, broth lukewarm, wine watered down to dull the senses rather than enliven them. He ate without appetite, forcing down each bite with the grim knowledge that sustenance was not meant to sustain him long. He asked for letters, but none were delivered. He spoke of his wife, of his children, of his estates and the affairs of England. But the jailer's expressions remained cold, unreadable. If they carried his words to Richard, he would never know. At times Thomas paced the narrow chamber allotted to him, his footsteps tracing grooves into the stone floor as though carving his unease into the very fabric of the room. At other times, he sat motionless, staring through the narrow slit of a window at the restless sea. The Channel waters rolled endlessly, waves crashing against the French coast, as if mocking him with their freedom. He could almost hear England's shores beyond the horizon, yet they were as distant as another world. And always, he felt the weight of time pressing upon him. Each hour stretched long, yet each day seemed stolen, for he was not imprisoned to await trial. No court would be convened, no defense allowed. His fate was not in parchment or gavel, but in the will of a king who had long grown weary of his uncle's defiance. Thomas remembered the days when he had stood tall among the lords appellant, when he had dared to check Richard's extravagance and force him into submission. He remembered the cheers of Londoners, the cries of support from the Commons, the knowledge that he had once been the protector of England's law. Those memories were bitter now, for they marked him not as a hero, but as an enemy of the throne. The fortress whispered at night. The wind howled through broken shutters, rattling doors, and carrying with it voices imagined, snatches of words he thought he heard in the dark. Traitor, uncle, condemned. Sometimes he woke in the cold hours before dawn, convinced he had heard footsteps outside his chamber door, only to find silence pressing in once more. He was not alone, and yet he had never been more utterly abandoned. Whispers of death haunted him as tangibly as the sea's chill. He knew that his life balanced on the edge of a royal whim. Richard II, long humiliated, long mocked by his uncle's authority, had finally chosen to strike. And Thomas, though hardened by years of politics and war, still clung to a thin hope that blood ties might protect him, that the memory of Edward III's house, of brotherhood, of family, might stay Richard's hand. But each day that hope grew thinner. The meals arrived colder. The guards spoke less. The silence grew heavier. It was as though the world had already moved on without him, consigning him to the realm of the forgotten. At times he prayed, kneeling in the dim candlelight, his hands trembling not from age but from the weight of dread. At times he cursed, pacing with fury, railing against a nephew who would dare to treat him with such dishonor. But mostly he waited, suspended in that gray fog between life and death, where the certainty of one's end becomes more unbearable than the end itself. And so Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, lingered in the cold walls of Calais, not yet dead, but no longer living. A shadow waiting to be extinguished. September 1397. The fortress of Calais stood against the wind-swept coast, its grey stone walls battered by the restless waves of the Channel. To most, it was a symbol of England's power on foreign soil, a stronghold from which armies had marched, a bastion that had resisted French assault for decades. Yet on this night, its ancient stones became something else, not a fortress of security, but a stage for treachery, a prison that would transform into a tomb. Within those damp chambers, torches guttered and smoked against the heavy air. The Duke of Gloucester, Thomas of Woodstock, youngest uncle of the king, lingered in uneasy confinement. Once one of the most powerful men in England, he now lived in a state of suspended dread, watched, monitored, his fate left deliberately uncertain. The chill in the corridors carried more than the sea breeze. It carried the weight of silence, the unspoken knowledge that his enemies had decided his destiny. And then, in the deep hours of night, fate struck. Accounts from the time are contradictory, fractured, whispered through centuries like half-remembered nightmares. Chroniclers, often writing under fear of reprisal, recorded only fragments. Some spoke of hired killers slipping silently into his chamber, their faces hidden, their hands armed not with swords, but with a coarse cloth, pressing down against his mouth, smothering the Duke in his sleep. No blood, no cry, just the brutal stillness of a life extinguished. Others described a more violent end, that the Duke was overpowered, dragged from his bed, and suffocated beneath the crushing weight of heavy mattresses. His struggles silenced by layers of fabric, his final breath stolen by a method chosen not for mercy, but for concealment. Still others whispered of poison, a slow and insidious weapon poured into his food or wine, leaving no marks but ensuring that the Duke would never leave Calais alive. The truth, obscured by deliberate silence, may never be fully known. What is certain is that no public execution was held, no trial pronounced, no legal sentence declared. The Duke's death was not the outcome of justice. It was an assassination, ordered in secret, sanctioned by royal authority, carried out in the shadows of the night. And though no chronicler dared write Richard II's name as the murderer, the hand behind the act was unmistakable. All paths led to the king. For Richard, Thomas of Woodstock was more than an uncle. He was a rival, a reminder of past humiliations, a man who had stood against him in Parliament and forced him to bow before the power of the Lord's Appellant. Allowing Woodstock to live meant allowing the threat of rebellion to breathe. To Richard, there could be no peace until the Duke was gone. And so, Calais was chosen. Distant from the heart of England, removed from prying eyes, a place where whispers could be contained and inconvenient deaths explained away. In that fortress, on that night, the king's vengeance reached its most ruthless expression. Yet murder does not remain confined within stone walls. It seeps outward, like water through cracks, finding its way into the consciousness of a realm. News of Thomas's sudden death did not stay in Calais. Whispers traveled with sailors across the channel, with couriers along the roads, with rumors exchanged in the taverns of London. The people did not need a confession. They understood. They knew the king had struck down his uncle. Calais, once a fortress of England's pride, was transformed forever in the memory of the realm. No longer merely a bulwark of conquest, it became the silent accomplice of a royal crime. Its walls had witnessed the extinguishing of a great noble's life, and though they stood firm against armies, they could not contain the echo of betrayal. That echo reached Westminster. It reached the Tower of London. It reached the very heart of England, carried not by heralds, but by fear, by suspicion, and by the collective knowledge that no man, however noble, however close to the blood of kings, was safe from Richard's wrath. The murder of Thomas of Woodstock was not just a killing. It was a statement. It was Richard declaring to the realm that his authority was absolute, that no one, not even his own blood, could defy him and survive. Yet for all the king's attempts to smother truth with silence, history remembers. The chroniclers who hinted at strangling, the whispers of smothering, the rumors of poison, they all endure. And with them endures the shadow of Calais, a place where loyalty and kinship gave way to fear and death. That night, Calais ceased to be merely a fortress. It became a grave, a monument to betrayal. And in the stillness of those chambers, Thomas's last breath became a ghost that would haunt Richard II's reign forever. The death of Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of another, a story woven in lies, denials, and half-whispered truths. What happened on that night in Calais could not remain in Calais alone. Deaths of princes never do. They ripple outward, through courts, through kingdoms, and through history itself. And yet, Richard II and his circle understood something with chilling clarity. If the murder of Gloucester were ever to be admitted openly, the throne itself might tremble. So, a cover-up began. The machinery of royal proclamation moved swiftly. Couriers were dispatched. Heralds were instructed. The official word was framed in tones of solemnity and mourning, as though rehearsed for a theater performance. The message was clear, repeated from the ramparts of Calais to the halls of Westminster. The Duke of Gloucester has died of natural causes. He fell into sudden illness. He passed peacefully in his chamber. No mention of suffocation. No mention of cloaked figures entering his room by torchlight. No whispers of pillows pressed down until breath was lost. The murder was erased from the record with the stroke of a quill and the authority of a crown. Gloucester's body was prepared with haste, and it was sealed into a coffin so tightly that not even the grieving family could gaze upon his face. The coffin itself became a symbol, not of mourning, but of silencing. Guards were posted to ensure no curious eyes or trembling hands would dare pry it open. The king had spoken. His word was law, and the law declared that Gloucester had died naturally. But England is a land where tongues are never so easily bound. Whispers began almost as quickly as the proclamations were made. In the taverns of London, ale was spilled as men leaned across rough-hewn tables and murmured, "No man as strong as Gloucester falls suddenly ill." In noble halls, ladies exchanged knowing glances as servants hurried in and out with trays, carrying rumors faster than they carried food. Even peasants, tilling the soil far from the king's court, repeated the same refrain with certainty. The Duke did not die of sickness. He was murdered. The cover-up revealed more than it concealed, each detail designed to silence suspicion. The sealed coffin, the guarded body, the rehearsed proclamations only confirmed what people already believed. The denial itself became proof. The silence itself became evidence. In Westminster, lords shifted uneasily on their benches, daring not to voice aloud what they whispered in corridors, that their king had arranged the murder of his own uncle. To say so openly was dangerous. To repeat it in private was unavoidable. For those who stood close to the throne, the truth was clear, though never spoken. They knew Richard had crossed a line from which no monarch could safely return. Kings have enemies. Kings have rivals. But when a king stains his crown with the blood of family, with the blood of one of England's princes, the crown itself begins to rot. Still, the performance had to be maintained. Monks were instructed to chant for Gloucester's soul as though he had passed in grace. Chroniclers were paid, and pressured, to write in their rolls that sickness had claimed him. Funeral rites were staged with solemn care, the coffin draped in velvet, the cortege lined with guards. The image of piety cloaked the reality of betrayal. But the people did not forget. In marketplaces, the gossip spread with a venom that no proclamation could cleanse. A merchant swore he had spoken to a sailor from Calais who had heard the Duke's death cries. A knight claimed a servant had slipped away from the fortress that night and carried the tale of smothering with him. A priest, bold in his sermon, hinted that Gloucester's sins had been absolved not by illness but by violence. Rumor became story. Story became belief. Belief became truth in the hearts of the people, and the king could not silence it. Every denial sounded hollow. Every gesture of mourning rang false. Richard had turned his court into a stage of fear, where courtiers clapped when they were told to clap and wept when they were told to weep. Behind the scenes, their whispers betrayed their terror. If Gloucester could be killed in silence, so could they. The cover-up stretched across months, layered like shrouds upon the body of truth. Letters were burned. Witnesses were silenced. Chroniclers hesitated with their quills. Some wrote one version for the king's eyes and another, hidden, for posterity. The contradiction between record and memory widened with every passing week. The sealed coffin, returned to England, was laid in earth, yet it did not bury suspicion. Instead, it planted it. From that seed grew a bitter harvest that would haunt Richard's reign. And so, the cover-up failed in its ultimate purpose. It did not preserve the throne. It did not absolve the king. Instead, it branded Richard forever with suspicion, a suspicion that history would never wash away. His reign had been transformed. No longer was he merely a king quarreling with lords. He was a king who killed his uncle and then lied to the realm. This was the legacy of Calais. A coffin that could not contain the truth, a proclamation that could not silence rumor, and a king who, by attempting to cover a crime, revealed it more plainly than any chronicler ever could. The death of Thomas of Woodstock sent shockwaves across the kingdom. Word of it spread not in proclamations, not in trumpets, not in banners carried through towns, but in whispers. In taverns and marketplaces, in abbeys and manor halls, the news carried on hushed voices, each whisper heavier than the last. The king's uncle is dead. That was all that needed to be said. No details, no explanations, no official declaration could bury what the people already understood. Among the nobles, unease quickly soured into dread. For years they had lived in the shadow of Richard's wrath, watching him lash out against critics, exile favorites, and demand obedience with the arrogance of unchecked authority. But this was different. If a king could turn on his own blood, on a man of Gloucester's stature, a royal duke, son of a king, brother of a king, then what protection was there for anyone else? A silence hung over the royal courts of England. Meetings of the nobility grew tense, with words chosen carefully and voices lowered to cautious whispers. Lords who once openly debated the crown's policies now watched their tongues, aware that any criticism, however slight, might be interpreted as treason. Fear crept through the chambers of power like smoke through cracks in a door, and yet fear was only one half of it. The other was anger. Among many of the great lords, resentment had been simmering for years. Resentment of Richard's extravagance, his favoritism toward courtiers they despised, his obsession with personal glory. Now, with Gloucester dead, those grievances coalesced into something darker. The conviction that Richard was no longer merely a misguided king, but a tyrant, willing to murder his own uncle to silence opposition. The clergy, too, whispered. Bishops who had once spoken carefully of the divine right of kings now began to tread a thinner line, fearful that their loyalty to Richard might be judged by future generations. A king who killed a duke of royal blood carried a stain upon his soul that no ritual blessing could wash away. From cathedral pulpits, priests thundered vaguely about Cain and Abel, about blood crying from the ground, about rulers who forget that they too are judged by heaven. No names were spoken, but everyone knew. And among the common people, outrage spread with a rawness that no chronicler's pen could fully capture. To them, Thomas of Woodstock was not merely a duke. He was a symbol. He was the uncle who had once dared to challenge the king's reckless ways, the lord who stood for law when Richard's court seemed bent on vanity and waste. They remembered him as a man who had sought to protect the realm from misrule, who had spoken the words they dared not. His murder was not only the silencing of a prince, it was, in their eyes, the death of justice itself. The outrage of the people echoed in markets and on village greens. If the king kills his own uncle, they muttered, what will stop him from killing us? Mothers hushed their children, warning them never to speak against the crown. Old men shook their heads and muttered that England had seen tyrants before, and tyrants always fell, and fall Richard would. Chroniclers of the age struggled with their duty. Many dared not write the truth, for they knew what happened to those who angered the king. Yet even in their veiled words, the judgment was clear. The Duke of Gloucester died suddenly, they recorded, at Calais. But the suddenness itself was telling, and between the lines, between the gilded letters and careful phrases, ran the truth. Richard had stained his reign with blood. In cloisters and scriptoriums, monks copied the tale in hesitant strokes, sometimes leaving spaces on the parchment where words had been removed, erased, or rewritten. History was being bent under the weight of royal pressure, yet it bent imperfectly. No cover-up could fully erase what every man, woman, and child already suspected. Even in France, whispers reached the ears of kings and courtiers. Foreign diplomats, long suspicious of Richard's temper, now spoke of him as dangerous, unstable, a monarch whose pride would be his undoing. Gloucester's death did not strengthen Richard's hand on the international stage. It weakened it, branding him as a ruler unworthy of trust. And Richard himself? He acted as though nothing had changed. He rode in procession. He wore his crowns. He demanded his courtiers kneel and his people cheer. But the cheers were quieter now, the obedience more strained. Even in his triumph, he must have sensed it. The loyalty of his kingdom was not secure. With Gloucester's blood on his hands, or at least upon his command, he had crossed an invisible threshold. He had turned fear into fury, suspicion into certainty, loyalty into hatred. The echo of Gloucester's death reverberated across England. It was more than the loss of a man. It was the turning of the tide. In killing his uncle, or in allowing him to be killed, Richard had set his feet upon a road that would lead not to greater power, but to downfall. The people knew it. The nobles knew it. The church knew it. Even the chroniclers, in their careful, coded way, knew it. And Richard himself, though he would never admit it, must have felt it too. The reign of Richard II had been bloodied, and in that blood was written a prophecy. The king who silenced his uncle would one day be silenced himself. The murder of Thomas of Woodstock would not end with his silent passing in Calais. It was not a death that could be buried beneath stone, nor concealed within parchment. It was a wound cut into the body of the English crown itself, one that would fester for the remainder of Richard II's troubled reign. From the moment whispers of his uncle's demise reached English shores, suspicion became the shadow that walked at Richard's side. He could host grand tournaments, commission splendid tapestries, and march beneath banners of royal authority. But to many of his lords, he was no longer the divinely appointed shepherd of the realm. He was the nephew who had allowed, perhaps even ordered, the murder of a prince of the blood. Every gesture of his rule, every act of governance, became tainted by the memory of Gloucester's death. When Richard seized the estates of his rivals, when he imposed new taxes on an already weary kingdom, when he crushed dissent with cold efficiency, these were not seen as the actions of a king maintaining order. They were read as the deeds of a man corrupted by the taste of blood. If he had dared to strike down his own uncle, what hope did a mere subject have in defiance? Thus Richard's authority, though wrapped in the grandeur of kingship, grew brittle and fragile. The crown still gleamed upon his brow, but its weight pressed down heavier with each passing year. The loyalty of his nobles was not born of respect, but of fear, and fear is a currency that cannot be spent forever. For Gloucester did not die in silence. His memory became a spectre that stalked the court. Some swore that the halls of Westminster echoed with the tread of his unseen feet, that his restless spirit walked beside the throne itself. Others spoke in hushed tones of divine justice, that God would not allow so heinous a crime to go unpunished. And indeed, the wheel of fortune began to turn. Henry Bolingbroke, the son of Richard's exiled uncle John of Gaunt, returned from banishment with a claim not only to lands, but to justice. His cause was strengthened not merely by politics or ambition, but by the whispered conviction that Richard's reign was poisoned, cursed from the moment blood had been spilled at Calais. When Bolingbroke raised his standard, many rallied to him not only out of loyalty to Lancaster, but out of quiet vengeance for Gloucester. It was as though Thomas of Woodstock himself rose from the grave, his unavenged death demanding reckoning. Richard, who had cast his uncle into shadow, now found himself dragged into the same darkness. He was seized, deposed, and confined, forced to taste the bitter humiliation he had once inflicted upon kin. Chroniclers of the age, writing with careful pens, often paused when they reached the year of Gloucester's death. Some left blank spaces, others cloaked their words in vagueness. Yet after Richard's downfall, the silence was broken. The connection was too clear, too poetic for medieval minds to ignore. The hand of God, it was said, had struck down the king who shed royal blood. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, became in death what he could never fully achieve in life: a symbol. Not a symbol of triumph, nor of enduring power, but of the fragility of kingship itself. His murder revealed the peril of unchecked authority, that a king who places himself above the laws of blood and bond courts ruin not only for his enemies, but for himself. His legacy was a warning carved into the memory of England, that betrayal within bloodlines is the sharpest blade of all, and that tyranny carries within it the seed of its own destruction. History does not recall him for victories on the battlefield, nor for the magnificence of his estates. Instead, Thomas of Woodstock endures as a ghostly reminder of a kingdom torn by mistrust, of a monarch undone by his own choices, and of a death that reshaped the destiny of a realm. For in the echoes of his fall, England learned that no crown is invincible, and no king untouchable. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, the forgotten prince. Murdered in silence, buried under lies, yet remembered in whispers. His death was not merely a crime of blood, but a mirror held up to monarchy itself, reflecting the peril of absolute power. And though his story has faded from the chronicles of kings, the shadow of his fate lingers still, an eternal reminder that betrayal leaves scars deeper than crowns.
Subscribe for more untold history.